I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator of the panel, Professor Stewart Gabriel, my colleague and a dear friend of mine. Stewart is the Arden Realty Chair and Professor of Finance at UCLA Anderson. His interesting and amazing research focuses on real estate and economics in the US, and with some very interesting insights on the Israeli real estate and economy, real estate sector and economy. Stewart is also a great lover of Israel and a great professor, and leads a number of programs at UCLA Anderson, including trips for business students from around the world to basically see and experience Israel firsthand. So essentially there's no one better to lead a panel on the interaction between Israel and the US and the business and economics relationship between Israel and US. So without further ado, Professor Stewart Gabriel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you who don't find yourself on the UCLA campus often, we're delighted to have you at UCLA, and UCLA is very proud of the work of the Nazarian Center and the myriad of contributions of the Nazarian Center, and you're an important part of that work. I don't know if our former chancellor was recognized yet this morning, but Albert Carnicel is here, and delighted to have you with us. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Udi. Udi is a professor in the area of finance in the Anderson School of Management. He's a UCLA finance PhD, so we're delighted, Udi, for your work as well. Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to move from religion to society and to business and all the rest. And by the way, Elisa left off talking about Kissinger and Golda. And I have to say, I was walking around Tel Aviv a couple of weeks into the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Kissinger finally decided to rearm Israel. And Israel, as you know, at that point in time was desperate for that armament. And I remember standing in Tel Aviv and looking up and seeing the US Air Force flying the gear straight in. And it was a memorable day. Anyway, here's a very brief version of a story that we're going to expand upon. Many of you are familiar with the terminology of startup nation. And you're familiar with this idea that there is a highly disproportionate agglomeration of tech innovation in the state of Israel. So you take a place that's got a population, roughly speaking, that of LA County, that's got a geography, roughly speaking, of the LA metro area, maybe the 5 counties. And this place has exceeded all expectation with respect to innovation, with respect to listing of company on NASDAQ, with respect to exit, with respect to wealth creation and innovation. And of course, the apps that we use on our phone directly reflect much of this innovation. So there's been a lot written and a lot discussed in terms of the factors in Israel that create that hotbed of innovation. Some of those factors are imposed on Israel with respect to geography and small numeric size. Some of those factors relate to the conflict as we see today in Gaza. Some of the factors relate to the culture and religious affiliation of the Jews of the state, and the ability to, where questions are permitted and where failures permitted on the part of business enterprises and all the rest. So we have the factors and we have the phenomenon, this phenomenon of agglomeration. We put that into the context of Israel, that is a well-functioning economy, but a place that is gravely limited, as I've said, in terms of what I would call scalability. There is with this hotbed of innovation and application, the innovation and the application have to be taken to markets, and markets where there are scale. And those markets are the markets of the US, the markets of China, increasingly today, a direct flight from Tel Aviv to Beijing and the Guangzhou and the like, and other sorts of markets. And of course, a great historical affinity, and political affinity and cultural affinity and all the rest between the United States and Israel. So it's the first place in terms of trade and culture and everything else that the Israeli startup would come would be to the US. So with that, we have the phenomenon, we have the connectivity, and we have a third point, which is that the pump has been primed. And the pump has been primed by activities of the Israeli government with institutions of cooperation that have been created between Israel and the United States. And we're going to talk about this momentarily. So what's our panel going to do? We're going to take this Israel-US business connectivity and we're going to begin to pull it apart. We're going to begin to examine it. We're going to try to understand the nature of the collaboration, the depth, the challenge, the opportunity, the threat. We're going to look at all sorts of activities that are associated with the infusion of collaboration. And in that particular respect, we're going to then go on and talk about some other elements of challenge. So with that, I'm going to introduce my panelists, but I'm going to do that one by one because each one is going to come up and tell some part of the story very briefly. And as they tell that part of the story, we'll get down to some conversation amongst ourselves and also hopefully with you. So the first person who I'd like to ask to say a few words is Yair Vardi. Oh, before I introduce Maya, I should say that two members of the panel came from Tel Aviv. And let's see, Karmit and Chedva both came from Tel Aviv, and I think, we should at least acknowledge the fact that they came a long way and made a great effort to be with us this morning. Maya came from Silicon Valley. And so Maya is going to talk first because she is the representative of an entity called the BIRD, the Binational Industrial R&D entity that historically tied the US and Israel together starting in 1977. The BIRD was one of the first agreements to prime this pump of business connectivity. So this is a very important, historically important entity. Maya is bringing it forward to today and to the future. So Maya is the Director of Business Development, head of the West Coast for the BIRD, and she is responsible for initiating business activities between US and Israeli companies and many, many other things. You've read all about her bio in the program. So Maya, perhaps a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a big honor. So I am an Israeli living in the Silicon Valley for many years now. Very happy to be working with the Bird Foundation. I think that for me, being far from Israel, it was a great way of staying connected and feeling that I'm engaged in something that is making a difference and helping both the Israelis and the Americans. So what is BIRD? As Professor Stewart said, this is an acronym, although sometimes I answer calls about injured birds. I have to apologize that I don't know how to help in that regard. But we were established back in the 70s by the two governments, the US and the Israeli government, wanted to promote innovation and collaboration between American and Israeli companies. They established the fund. They gave us an endowment of $110 million that we still use. We use the interest on the endowment and repayments of successful projects. And we fund joint R&D projects between American and Israeli companies. We are looking to fund the more risky, innovative technologies. things that maybe regular VCs won't take. The risk is high. Return on investment might be lengthy. This is where we come into play. We are agnostic to sector, so we fund any technology besides defense. And we give up to 50% of the R&D expenses for each partner. The US and the Israeli company both get paid by us up to $1 million per project. And the good thing is that we're doing that not for profit. We don't take any IP rights, intellectual property rights, or equity in the company or the project. But we do ask that if the project is successful and reaches sales, the companies repay us. Not all our projects are successful because we choose the more risky ones. But we do get about a third repaid, which is not bad for our model. We funded more than 1,000 projects so far, which is a lot. Think of 1,000 companies on each side of the ocean working together, collaborating. This is something that has a huge impact. We gave more than $350 million so far from that original endowment, which is incredible. And we are proud to try and reach also areas, more remote areas that are not Silicon Valley or LA or New York, and try to bring the knowledge of this program to other companies that maybe don't know of Israeli companies to partner with. And the majority of our work is, besides the funding, is the matchmaking. We facilitate introductions. So my day-to-day job is talking to companies and telling them about this funding opportunity and trying to be showing the funding as an incentive to choose an Israeli company to partner with, and maybe not a company from India or from the Ukraine. So I'm trying to find what interesting technology I can present to them. And I do that on both sides. I speak to Israeli companies who are looking for partners in the US. They'll tell me what they're looking for, and we will try to make connections and to make introductions for them. And then I do it on the other way around. I spoke on Friday morning with a company from San Diego who is looking for an Israeli partner. They'll send me a short value proposition, some information about themselves, and we will try to scout for interesting technologies in Israel and make the introductions, and then see if the companies, once they talk to each other, if they agree and decide to submit a proposal for BIRD. Our process is very fast, so it's 3 months for a government program from submission to decisions. We see companies that are successful come back for more projects, so we're very proud of that. And we have 2 cycles each year. We fund about between 20 to 25 projects, so about $25 million a year. We do have 2 special programs. One was founded 10 years ago by the Department of Energy and the Israeli Ministry of Energy for renewables and energy efficiency. We added advanced manufacturing to that, water energy nexus, and there is a lot of activity, especially in California and in this area and down in San Diego. And then we have a program that started 3 years ago, funded by the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Israeli Ministry of Public Security. It started as a program that was looking for technologies, to fund technologies for first responders. And this year we extended it to be more, to be broader homeland security technologies. So this is a new area where in the Silicon Valley it was more high tech, and now I'm looking into radios and wearables for firefighters. Very exciting. There is a new program that we started last week. The call for proposal came out, and it's a new energy center that Bird will manage. And this is a bit different. All our programs are the same. We give $1 million to two companies that are collaborating. In the energy and the homeland security, it can be also a university and a research institute. So that makes it more research oriented. In the energy center, it's going to be consortiums of universities, companies, a broader program with more money, longer projects in 4 topics. And I'm trying to reach companies and researchers that are interested in working with Israel and the other way around. This is what I do. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear from each of the panelists briefly, and we'll get into the conversation momentarily. But now let me introduce Yair Vardi. And Yair, as you've seen, your program is co-founder and partner in Fusion LA. This is an accelerator for Israeli startups here in LA. He has a very rich background in the sector. He's worked with many such entities, and also for the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Yair, please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Stewart. Great honor to be here at UCLA. Interesting enough, 6 years ago, I came here actually for the first time, worked at Hillel on campus, so this is feels like home. I'll start and maybe in 2 sentences just say what we're doing right now at Fusion. Fusion is our startup. We started it 20 months ago, so a bit less than 2 years. This September it's going to be 2 years. We're an accelerator program. What does it mean? We invest small money in many startups, and we're trying to help them set a shop in the US. We bring 6 to 8 companies every 6 months here to Santa Monica. We rent them housing, and we help them network with people that could be their clients, their investors, and hopefully, and we have 2 examples on this panel, Kalmit and Chedva, 6 months after the program or a year after the program, they've established their US office and they could scale to the US market, get clients, raise their next institutional round here in the US. So that's in a gist what we're doing. We've invested in 27 companies. Of those, in total, they've raised more than $40 million, and it's just the beginning for our new venture. I'm more interested to touch on a few points, a little bit about the challenges that Israeli founders face when coming here to the US, and I think it's across the board. And I'll try to touch specifically challenges that early stage founders face when they're coming to the US market. The first one that is generic to any immigrant coming to the US. It's just finding the sense of home and community. Many Israelis came to the US or for a students exchange program, or used to work a relocation to the US, some come to MBA. But from my experience, 2/3 of the founders we worked with were first-time founders and didn't have that luggage, that experience of working in the US. And there is a cultural differences between Israelis and American. I'm sure you know that from your friends, from your family in Israel. And our goal in the program is also help those founders position themselves as US companies with great Israeli R&D doing business in America, and not Israelis coming to America to do business. And there's a difference on on the code of practice of how you do business in the US, and maybe those are things that Israelis need to learn better, but utilizing the great technical expertise in Israel from military, from intelligence, from Air Force, etc., and help those companies position themselves and Americanize their value prop to the market here. So another challenge, besides the cultural challenge, is establishing trust. And trust takes time. And a big part of what we're trying to do is help those founders get some credibility, because we source hundreds of companies coming here every 6 months. And just the sales cycles here, unlike in Israel, which is a village that you know your uncle works in this company and your friend from the unit that you served with could become your first clients, establishing and sales cycles here in the US are much longer, 6 to 12 months, which is unthinkable in Israeli standards. And Israelis, when they come here, need to face that reality and stay in the market. And we believe that as early as possible when they establish a business, they should come to the US, engage with their prospect clients. And I think it's easier to Israelis, especially millennials. I say most of our founders are up to their mid-30s. That's a usual Israeli founder, maybe until they're 40 years old. It's easier today to establish a commonality between Israelis and Americans. I think everybody watch the same Netflix shows, and they could speak about Steph Curry. And religion in the US is sports, and Israelis can relate to that when they're coming to a meeting, and that could be a great way to start a conversation here. And those are little things that Israelis need to learn. But I think it's easy with football. American football, college football, we're not good at all. But with NBA, I think it's helpful to start a conversation here in LA about that. Stewart mentioned the geographical size of Israel. I'm going to speak a little bit about the market. I think what's interesting is that Israel and LA market are facing tremendous growth in the last decade. Every year was a record year for Israeli ecosystem and Southern California ecosystem for the past 7-8 years. And actually in numbers, last year, $6.4 billion were invested in Israeli companies. And last year, in 2018, $6.4 billion were invested in Southern California and in the LA ecosystem. So the numbers of the LA metropolitan and Israel at large are quite similar. And there are many different ways to come and to join the U.S. market or to establish your presence here. An accelerator could be a good example for that, but could be bringing on advisors. It could be finding clients and design partners with the Bird Foundation. And we have one company that both the Bird Foundation supported and we supported in the agriculture space. And one thing I want to say about the Israeli ecosystem, and we're going to have examples later on, is that it used to be focused around cybersecurity. It's not just cybersecurity today. There are many more industries that are relevant to the U.S. market. Just to name it, machine learning and AI for old industries such as insurance, such as real estate, such as construction, such as agriculture. So a lot of the data play and statistic and mathematicians are in Israel could solve problems that are larger than security. Another topic is connected devices and mobilities, and mobility in general. Everything becomes connected today. Sensors are on everything, including consumer goods, and cars and infrastructure, and everything going to be tracked soon. And lastly, and maybe that is a topic that Guy will touch in a minute, is the wellness and predictive healthcare that Israel is at the forefront of.
Thank you, Yair. Some of you may be aware of the fact that one of the leading scientific institutions in Israel, the Weizmann Institute of Science, established very early on a commercialization unit where they took the the scientific discoveries of the scientists, the faculty at the Weizmann Institute, and sought to bring those discoveries into an applied commercialization phase. Our next speaker, Guy Rosenthal, who's down at the end, is responsible for that work here at UCLA. And he works specifically in the area of health sciences. He is a business development officer in biopharmaceuticals in the UCLA Technology Development Group. And as major universities around the world compete today, we compete as well with respect to funding that derives from commercialization of scientific discovery on the part of faculty. So Guy, thank you for being with us.
Good morning, everyone. Stewart, thank you for having me today and for the Nazarian Center. So I moved here to LA, to the US, about roughly 2.5 years ago, after spending majority of my life in Israel. And I think my remarks now are going to focus around some sort of, a realization to follow on with some sort of a challenge, and then some sort of a segue to an opportunity. So I think when I started working with global companies, with US-based companies mostly, I think I had this realization, I think that every Israeli, and I think you all my panelists, members can understand, can relate, is that when you come into the US, you understand that the US is a very process-driven community, and there's a box, and there's some sort of certain steps that you need to follow in order to get from point A to point B, from point B to point C. And some people like to think that they're, thinking outside of the box, but as long as we acknowledge the box, we see the box, and we follow the steps, we're all good. And then you go back to your roots, and you understand that you're Israeli, and we basically have no idea what a box is. And people tell us to follow steps, but we kind of wobble around and getting from one place to the other. And then after 10 years, we find ourselves in a startup raising Series A, Series B, Series C, and people ask us exactly what exactly was your path. We have no idea. And basically, this actually leads to some sort of recognition or realization that there's actually some certain assets and certain aspects to Israelis coming here, some advantages that we bring to the table. But when going from working with faculty members, with academia all across the country in Israel, which was fascinatingly easy, considering that in Israel we have 7 or 8, I think, universities today, about 5 medical schools across the country. And I recall, before coming here, I used to work for a small company called Chedva Pharmaceuticals. It used to be big, now it's a bit smaller. But we used to travel the country within one day, visiting all institutions and extracting innovation and knowledge and transferring technologies on a daily basis. And this is something that is extremely harder to do here. But from working with academics and coming here and working at UCLA today and looking at the level of innovation, the speed and pace of innovation, and more so actually leveraging the fact that this is a process-driven society, the execution part here is significantly, I think, at least in the biopharmaceutical space, that's where my area of specialty, it's on another level. I think it's only then it hit me that the challenges, and it's a growing concern of mine, that whatever we like to call a startup nation back home in Israel, the US is doing a great job in keeping up and actually advancing at a higher pace, speed than what we like to see at home. The funding levels, the different skill set that the US can provide, at least in the healthcare space as a whole, the medical space as a whole, is superior than what we have in Israel. I think we, in terms of the level, the exposure to the global markets, the marketing skills, the management skills, execution parts, and the scaling. Scaling is a critical component in evolution of companies, something that I think we're a bit lacking in terms of Israel. We're an amazing ideation society, and reducing to concept to practice, but take companies from A to B, from B to C, that's great, but taking them all the way from A to Z, that's a different process. And this is something that here in the US, it's been done significantly, more significantly better. And I think referring to also to what Yair said before, it's a groundbreaking number, like over $7 billion in terms of investment in Israeli companies. I think today we see more and more, and this specifically relates also to medical research is happening here at UCLA. What I used to see in Israel as some sort of a faculty member, it's getting $1 million grant for doing groundbreaking research in cancer. Here you see academic labs here at UCLA that have budgets of over $20 million. And this is, in Israel, this is like some sort of a small to medium-sized startup biotech company. And here you see this is an academic lab, purely academic, with like multiple $1 million in budgets. And it's enabling. It's enabling, you see therapies moving faster and quicker to the market. Even the geographic spread, we're closer here to, in terms of clinical positions, working with the FDA, working with the regulator, it's just a different space. But going back from this challenge to the opportunity, Israel is very uniquely positioned. Yes, we're small, but the fact that we're small and we're so compact, we're also extremely agile. The fact that we do not have processes put together enables us to be flexible and to be some sort of a testing ground for innovation and for US-based companies actually to tap into this resource and leverage that and find those points of mutual areas of interest and to bring it back into global scale, back into the US.
Great, thank you, Guy. So we've heard now from 3 different aggregators and integrators of startup activity and of research more generally here in the United States and from Israel. And now, as you heard from Yair, we have 2 examples of 2 entrepreneurs who are bringing their own companies to scale here in the US. And they both come from Israel. They're both graduates of Yair's group. And I'm going to call on Chedva Kleinhandler first. Chedva is born in Brooklyn and grew up in a suburb of Tel Aviv and doing very interesting work with a company called Emerj, where she is the founder and CEO. So Chedva, why don't you take us through it?
Thank you so much, Stewart, and thank you all for having me. Guy mentioned not understanding what a box is. I think that for me was a necessity because I don't think I had access to that box, even if I would see it from afar. I grew up in the ultra-Orthodox community, no higher education, only one woman in the extended family who worked outside the home, and I never thought I would sit in a panel like this or be in the WeWork Creator Awards pitching in front of 5,000 people in Jerusalem in June. But thank God I am here, but that's not because I wanted to start a startup. It's not because I ever saw myself as being a technological person. It's because I identified problems. That's what I do. I'm a people person. The latest problem that I identified a few years ago was the fact that the nature of work is changing. And as it's changing, and as 59% of millennials, I don't think I even knew the terminology then, value learning and professional growth over salary, organizations are struggling with providing those opportunities, and so they see things like employee attrition and so forth. And I won't go into the whole pitch, but I will say just for the context that what we do is we help your people not go, but grow. Jeffing off of Passover. But the important point here really is that I think one thing that we often forget when we talk about technology is the human problem. And I think what you're doing here is one of that's why this money is meaningful, right? And for that, I think Israelis are in a unique position because we're good at questioning things. But then what we need to, in order to grow that and to scale that, is the access to where we can actually solve those problems, the access to where those people who we can help are, and the organizations that we can collaborate with, etc. And one thing that we see, and the reason that we're so happy and proud to be part of Fusion LA, and the reason that I pretty much live on a plane, is of course the need to collaborate with either investors or organizations, or the knowledge that exists here. But also I think one really important point is to also establish, even with a team that's less than 10 people, we need to establish a team that has this treasure trove of experience and knowledge that comes from more than one perspective. So even as the majority of our team at this point is still in Tel Aviv, we have American expats, and we have ultra-Orthodox people, and we have people from many different sort of points and not only locations but also characteristics working with us or being us. And that I think is on the one side a luxury and something that, thank God for the internet, but on the other side it also poses a very unique challenge of like, how do you then bridge between all those communication styles and ways of doing things? How does one person not even know what a box is and one person excel because they follow the box? And then how can they work together in order to create a success, because each one needs the other. So those are things that are on top of my mind, and when I think about Israeli-American collaboration, experience, business, and especially technology, I think those are questions we need to ask ourselves.
Thank you. Okay, so our final speaker is Karmit Yadin, and Karmit comes to us from Tel Aviv. As I mentioned, she's a cybersecurity expert. She's co-founder and CEO of an entity called Arcus Team, and they are a security startup working in the cybersecurity space and based in Israel. So, Karmit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karmit Yadin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Arcus Team. One unique thing about our co-founding team is the fact that we are all coming from the cyber offensive industry. We've been attacking connected devices for our living, working with government agencies, and that gives us a unique take on how we think the cybersecurity for connected devices should act. The old news is that we're going into a connected world. But the bad news is that each connected device acts as an open door for a cyber attack. And this is exactly why we set up this company. Our life mission is to make sure that each connected device will be secure and that we and our kids will have a better world. Our business strategy is to keep the knowledge and the R&D team and the great mind and science in Israel, and to have business development and marketing set up here in LA, because we believe it's the best market for us. And that's the most thing and important about us. We automated the entire process about making all the connected device secure, so it is available. We created that, and we're very proud of that. And we're here now. Thanks.
Great. So we're going to do a little bit of eclectic conversation Q&A now, but I'm going to start with Karmit. And Karmit, you could have gone to Berlin, or you could have gone to Guangzhou, or certainly Silicon Valley. Why LA? Why are you coming to LA?
Okay, so we find LA as a very interested market. As I mentioned before, it's important for us to keep the mind and the fact that we are Israeli, that coming for actually to change the concept of connectivity in the world. So it's important for us to be Israelis. And here in LA, it's the biggest Israeli arm. So we feel like we're keeping the fact that we are Israeli, the fact that we are here. So this is one. The second, the market really likes us here and wants us, and we feel like there is a great need for great technology company in LA. and they welcome us, and we're happy to be here.
Great, great, thank you. I wanted to ask all the panelists, each of you from your perspective, your separate perspective, and Karmit, you know, you've told us a little bit about cybersecurity, and we know the connectivity between the situation on the ground in Israel and cybersecurity, but where else are we going in this next phase of innovation from a sectoral and application perspective? And why don't we start with Guy and just come straight down the line and give us a sense of what the bold new horizons look like in that regard.
Yes, so I'm going to refer to my space, which is mostly the healthcare or the biopharmaceutical space. I think the fact that we used to start, even like when I just walked into the industry about like 10, 15 years ago, it was extremely hard to raise money. And you used to see the companies the first round of funding with even like $1 million, $5 million. There's a strong shift both in what we try to do in terms of impact and both in the funding. I'll touch first about the impact. When basically the industry, the biopharmaceutical industry started, and you can take Teva as an example, where it's developing drugs or treatments to basically change diseases from becoming devastating diseases to chronically manageable diseases. And that was the entire paradigm or the thesis for pharma companies as a whole. We're getting into walking already, we're deeply in an era of actually curing disease. So instead of treating the diseases and the disease symptoms, we're walking into using technology and the recent development of science, scientific discoveries to actually cure disease and to modify the disease towards finding a cure and not just a treatment. And I think part of it is also because another trend, the shift, which is in funding. What used to be a seed round of $1 million, today a seed round for, let's say, a disease-modifying company, biotech company, a seed round can be $10 million. A Series A, just recently, last year, a company that partially was formed with a UCLA faculty, went from nothing, basically from some sort of a strategic collaboration with a pharma company, and they raised a Series A, first round, out of formation of $300 million. Within a year, 6 months, they went public. Today, they're worth over $3 billion. And recently, another company, which is some sort of a conglomerate of information and innovation from the US, went from nothing to a Series A of $850 million. So the level of funding, almost in the biopharma, it's well known, specifically in oncology also, money is not an issue. There's way too much money out there. Today, roughly $1.4 trillion is sitting outside, just wanting to go in. It's about creating those stories and those packages in terms of actually we can create what's called a better standard of care and actually delivering disease modifying and how we can actually cure diseases as opposed to just treat the disease.
So I think for me, two really important things that I can identify is that, Startup Nation is starting to mature, it's starting to expand, and I think the next step is expanding upon what is Startup Nation, what is an Israeli startup, in which verticals is the deal. Yair touched upon it a little bit, and also who is Startup Nation, who has access to do that. And I think the two have a very direct connection because traditionally, if we're going to think about an Israeli startup and what do foreign VCs come to Israel for, then we'll think about cybersecurity, we'll think about image recognition, we'll think about pals from the Army unit, right, that learned the technology together, developed it together, became, formed a camaraderie, and that's amazing, and that's still going on, and that's just gonna go from strength to strength. But I think as the Israeli business ecosystem is maturing and as more people get a seat at the table, we get to identify more problems that are perhaps tech-driven or perhaps tech-enabled in many different sectors. So in our specific vertical, we see a huge really blossoming of startups. I think just in Fusion LA, there were more than 3, 4, 5 HR tech or future of work startups. Even in our batch, that we were 2. But you'll see more B2C startups that traditionally had nothing to find and to do in Israel beyond, Waze, which is sort of the unicorn story that is sort of the anomaly that teaches you about the rule. So you'll see more of a myriad of a variety of problems and verticals, and you'll also see a big hunger, a big thirst for people who are outside the traditional founder story, both because we want in, but also because Israel needs to capitalize on those different groups, because there's the knowledge and the experience and the innovative way of thinking is not owned by just one group. So you'll see more and more ultra-Orthodox or just Orthodox people participating, thanks to some organizations like Kamatech, which is an accelerator that helps Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jewish people, integrate into high tech, whether through their hiring and training processes and traditional HR practices, or through their accelerator that picks 8 startups every 6 months and actually places them inside larger startups or corporates, so they get not only the opportunity but also the network. Because I didn't have a cousin whose company got acquired, or a friend from the army. So that's really important. You will see it. We see it in the Arab society. We see more and more women founders participating, and that's on the one hand a huge opportunity and a really optimistic thing that is happening. But on the other side, it's also a challenge, because then we need to expand not only the startups that are rising, but also does the Israeli industry or the US industry looking into Israel know how to cope with that different kind of startup and capitalize on different things that might have not been considered Israel's differentiation, Israel's sort of edge until now? Do we know to look beyond the pattern recognition? So I think that is the other really, really important thing when we're talking about Startup Nation 2.0.
So I go to a lot of conferences in the West Coast, and I think that, for example, the RSA, the cybersecurity conference, everyone knows that the Israeli pavilion is huge and has a lot of companies. Last year, I went for the first time to a construction tech conference, and we were invited to speak on a panel about Bird. And it was the first time that the construction companies heard about the Israeli tech and startups. We gave examples of projects that we funded. We didn't call it construction tech then because the name didn't exist, but technologies that can be applied in construction. And later, we walked the floor, and Israeli companies came to us and said, "Oh my God, thank you for putting us on the map." They were so excited to see Israel up there, and they said that because of the recognition in a sector that wasn't familiar with the possibilities, the options that Israel has to offer. The companies, the large companies, when they approached them and they said that they were from Israel, suddenly there was more interest. Oh, yeah, we are not famous for having construction tech companies. So we invest a lot in agriculture, in energy, in water, a lot of hardware. These are all the traditional areas where we funded projects. I do see today a lot of artificial intelligence and all the trends that we see all over the world. But I think that the exciting things would be really finding those new niches where Israel can contribute. We see a lot of multinationals moving, opening R&D shops in Israel, especially in the last few years. We see a lot of automotive interest. And I get a lot of calls about from innovation centers in the Silicon Valley looking for Israeli technologies. So there's a lot to do.
So in the cybersecurity space, I see the real big change is around who is the attacker. And we used to find governments as the attacker, but today those attackers are the teenagers that we all have at home. And this is the real threat. They can attack everywhere. They can attack anyone just because they can. And that, I think, the main change and the main concept and the different mindset we take as a company. And one of the way we're doing that is we actually hire them. We hire, so today we're 12, the technical team, we're 12 people, and 3 of us are teenagers that works for us after school time. And that's how we really create innovation, I believe.
And maybe speaking about teenagers, so I met Karmit's children. They were here with her last month with her husband, and 2 of her kids are teenagers. And for the entire dinner, they were sitting in their phones and watching other people play video games for the full. And I was shocked. But that's what they and I interviewed them about that for the entire dinner. And I'm sure if you have kids or grandchildren, that's what they're doing, watching video games. Today, instead of watching the NBA, they're watching video games, others people playing video games. So we're very bullish about that industry, the gaming industry. We've invested in 4 companies in that space. And you can imagine that LA is going to host the 2028 Olympics, and it's gonna be an Olympic sports, people playing video games, and by then we think this industry will even grow much more. So we think that's something very interesting to look at, besides also how we make cities smarter and convenient for people to go from place to place. So mobility, that's echoing some other stuff that was said. But another thing to think about sports and media and their intersection with city.
Great. So now we heard a little bit about the topic that I want to bring forward next, which is to flip this conversation directionally. In other words, rather than talking about the facilitation of Israeli company growth in the United States, let's talk about who's going to Israel and who isn't going to Israel in terms of U.S. companies, who's facilitating that process, is that process effectively facilitated, what are the challenges of U.S. firms coming to Israel. We know of the big behemoths, the Intel chip processing plants in Israel and this sort of thing. But other than that, what's going on at the level of the startup? What's lacking? What is being done? And I don't know who wants to go. We can go down the line. You want? Okay, we'll start with Guy. We'll go down the line.
So I think one thing is very interesting that is happening in Israel, and I think as Israelis, I think we've taken it for granted for years. Although I think the healthcare system, in terms of their the way the Israeli healthcare system was digitalized years ago, created a huge critical mass of data, fully computerized, even in the actual military medical records. And the entire electronic healthcare system is completely digitalized in Israel. And I think now American companies and medical centers, academic institutions understand that this is a huge resource for data-driven healthcare stratification, creating new models for value-based healthcare. And this is a tremendous shift that we see globally. And actually, when you ask here companies, which country do you see basically leading the entire data analytics space in healthcare? Everyone will say by far it's going to be Israel. And I think now we see also now companies, startup companies coming from Israel that are doing collaborations. One is also in the government level, when recently, I think last year, the Israeli government announced a digital health initiative across all the HMOs, and I think it's roughly $1 billion shekels or so, to basically provide access to data to those companies to create better solutions, then to be able to syndicate with global companies, US or global companies as a whole, to create better treatment strategies, to understand the connectivity between drugs and patients' data. And I think this is a huge opportunity moving forward.
So I think it's really fascinating to me because our market, our audience is corporates. So it's always very exciting when they come to Israel. And you mentioned Intel, which is actually the largest private employer in Israel with over 10,000 employees. So that's really interesting. But we have Amazon coming in, which is sort of stressing everyone because of the high salaries that they're promising developers and programmers. We have Google, Facebook are already old news, but there's a steady stream, and Maya mentioned automotive companies. For us, it's really interesting on the business level as potential collaborators, as it is for, like, I think a lot of times there are two different motives here, because the corporates come to Israel to get the talent, the R&D talent. So basically they set up an R&D center, but for us, one of the things, and for us generally as startups, one of the most important things is the access to the business collaboration. So you can see the R&D centers, and then you can see the innovation sort of sites or the biz dev sort of representatives. And what happens a lot of times is that even though those companies act and behave as multinational, there is sort of the Israeli enclave, but then in order to get real decision making, you do still need to get to the American headquarters. There's no running away from that. So that's on the one side. So we can't be naive and think that everything can be closed and all the deals can happen within this tiny country. On the other hand, the amazing thing that happens is people who set up those sites in Israel, those R&D sites, those innovation offices, a lot of times on top of the company culture, right? The company culture of Facebook or Google or Intel, they also still have a very Israeli startup culture. And yeah, they feel very stable in their paycheck at the end of the month, and they're not raising money, but still there's this camaraderie and this joy of innovation. So what happens is, for us, even though we can't, say, okay, our work here is done, I can rest and stay with my family and never go on a plane again to LA or New York or Silicon Valley, still it's much more attainable to network within the Israeli ecosystem and to form those relationships that then when you come to the Silicon Valley or to LA or to New York, you come in a much better position with a personal, warm introduction. So that's a really, really important point, I think, for us at least as a tiny startup.
So I want to give a different perspective, actually not talk about the multinationals and the large companies. Originally, when Bird was funded, the projects that we saw were mainly small startups with large US companies that provided the access to market. We see a shift, and that's interesting. So we funded, not recently, a company from LA with a nanosatellite company with Elbit, a large Israeli company. So we see those companies taking advantage of our program and doing business in Israel, which actually brings them access to the European market and opens more opportunities for them. So we see a lot of startups now from the U.S. that had no connection to Israel, arriving to Israel, doing business in Israel, hiring people, and this is very exciting. And it wasn't what they originally thought when they established the fund, but this is an interesting shift. And we're proud to say that we make a difference also in the U.S. startup community.
So the way I see it from a super technology company, I see that the big giants American companies are coming to Israel for scouting startups. They are not scouting the startups, they're actually scouting the IP, they're scouting the technology, and it's nice if you want to do a quick round, quick thing, do a quick exit, and that's fine. But I want to believe that if you want to do, to actually establish Israeli company, to be a big company and multinational company, you have to have a presence in Israel, but you have to have a presence in the US. And together with Fusion LA, that's what we're trying to change. That's what we're trying to do, to create a bigger companies from startups and from great technology and from great idea to go outside and not just to be a startup nation, but also to be able to create real companies. I think that's the thing.
Maybe a few more numbers relates to your question about how multinationals come to Israel. So here in LA, there's a few big corporations that have R&D centers in Israel. Snapchat just bought a big entity in northern Israel, Simagen, an Israeli startup, in order to employ their data scientists in northern Israel. So they have a big operation there. There's Cornerstone on Demand and ZipRecruiter. They have offices in Israel. And today, the number is more than 350 multinationals that have some sort of operation in Israel, besides Facebook and Google, that acquired companies in Israel and built their R&D teams there. I must say that also European entities and the big automotive companies and industries from Germany specifically started to become very involved in the Israeli ecosystem. Mercedes-Benz and other corporations sponsor programs in Tel Aviv, scouting for technologies around mobility. In the whole Intel buying Mobileye for billions of dollars also boosted that ecosystem. Lastly, in terms of venture capital, it used to be that most of the money, or all of it, came from the U.S. To the venture, the VC community in Israel. It's different now, and it's still U.S. investors or North America are the majority, 60-70%, but 30-40% today coming from other areas of the world, including China, leading and investing in Israeli VC, Southeast Asia, and European markets as well. So that's also a shift that for the Israeli tech ecosystem.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost out of time. I want to take a question or two from the audience, but I have one more question that maybe we'll handle very, very quickly, although not doing it justice, and then we'll do what we can together in the remaining time. And the question's introduced as follows. In major business schools in the United States, certainly here at UCLA, we spend time thinking about what's called corporate social responsibility. And what that has to do with our bottom lines that go beyond the express profit statement of the individual firm and the connectivity between that firm and the society in which it works. And of course, we see in Israel, just like we see in the US, higher levels of income inequality and higher levels of wealth inequality and all the rest, in part as an artifact of the success of the tech sector in Israel. So the question, very, very briefly for our panelists, for Israel, for the United States, how are the phenomena that you're associated with going to be part of a corporate social responsibility statement as well. And Guy, we'll start with you as usual. Go straight in.
Yes, I think in the healthcare industry as a whole, I think, unfortunately, I think Israel is a bit behind in terms of the entire concept of CSR. But in terms of the healthcare, I think we already see the patient being a very integral part of the solution. And patient advocacy groups, patient engagement, different diseases across the spectrum are being involved in the actual drug development process itself. And aside from access to care and the entire shift into like the value-based care model, where we're going to provide a better care for a similar or lower cost, I think there's very interesting things and different models that can be done specifically in Israel and the way it's positioned.
So for us, before we dreamt about the business, we dreamt about making the world a better place sorry for the cliche, or as you mentioned before, tikkun olam, feeling that if employees had more opportunities at work, then first of all, it would be a better, more fair workplace, but also it would actually benefit the workplaces in the organization. And that's why we wake up every morning. That's why we left our previous successful businesses. That's what we do. And also, to go back to my previous points, in our team, it's really important to us, and it's not, we don't view it as CSR, we view it as who we are. Diversity, not only of backgrounds or gender or other locations, but diversity of thought. We come from very, very different places and backgrounds in the Israeli and American society, from the LGBT community, as well as from Bnei Brak, the ultra-Orthodox town outside Tel Aviv, as well as having developers in Shechem and Nablus and Palestinian Authority. And that's part of our DNA. And seeing more and more there, like that around us, and I think that's an amazing shift that's just gonna make startups in Israel more valuable, not only in values, but actually as businesses.
Our board of governors have people from both governments, the chief scientist from Israel, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the State Department, Treasury. We bring the projects to them and they look at the innovation and the synergy between the companies. The scores are usually for that. But we will try to choose the projects that have social impact, for sure. So you won't see a lot of gaming projects. We have a lot of medical and digital health projects. A lot of energy, pharma projects. We're trying to make a difference by funding those projects that will change the world. We also try to look at the projects and the synergy between the companies to make sure that even if the technical project fails and doesn't reach commercialization, we hope to see value for both companies, job creation. We know that by participating and collaborating, it helps them raise funding. Sometimes our projects end with acquisitions, and we are proud of that. We're trying to help remote locations. As I said, for example, we had no projects from Montana. I visited Montana. We tried to initiate conversations with companies there, and was very proud that this year a project from Montana was selected, tribal company. So this is very exciting that companies from those places that didn't hear about Israeli tech are now working and collaborating, and I believe that one by one we are making a difference.
As a young startup, we cannot compromise about the quality of the technical team that we hire. So we engage with a community called Magshimim. They take young kids from the periphery outside Tel Aviv, and these kids are geniuses, literally geniuses. So we engage with them, we hire them in our company, and we as a company get the best technical team ever. They are like amazing programmers. And together with that, we give them the opportunity that people in Tel Aviv and people with more money will have, with more connection will have. They actually get a job in startup company, and they get the opportunity, and hopefully they'll get to the best positions in the army and afterwards. So.
Maybe an observation and that I can add is that establishing a company, a startup in the U.S., same in Israel, it's been becoming a startup founder. It's a privilege, and most people that go to start those companies come from higher education in Israel. They went to the special forces or the intelligence corps or the Air Force, and their socioeconomical situation allows them the privilege of starting a company. And it's hard, because even in the application, in terms of a social impact, to look for those diverse teams. So we need to actively look for startups coming outside of programs funded by the government or by other nonprofits that are tackling the Orthodox community in Israel or the Arab community in Israel. And there are more programs trying to help and give entrepreneurs coming from specifically the Haredi community and the Arab community in Israel access to the ecosystem and network in Tel Aviv, and we're trying to tap into that. We're proud that we've invested in 25% of the portfolio is women-led, but there's a lot of more societal issues that Israel and the US need to solve in order for that to be equal in the next few years.
Great.